James chapter 1, starting in verse 1 to 18. Hear the word of the Lord. James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, greetings. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. For you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness. And let steadfastness have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given him. But let him ask in faith, with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and let the rich man in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass, he will pass away. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass, its flower falls and its beauty perishes. So also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. Blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say when he is tempted, I am being tempted by God. For God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin. And sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his treasures. May the Lord add his blessings to the reading of his holy word. The common question students ask, the conversation starter often after exams, is, well, how'd you do on the test? Was it hard? Was it on what you studied? Were you prepared? Maybe was it the kind of test you were expecting? You studied for a multiple choice test, but it was an essay test. Were you just left up to yourself to figure out what to study? Maybe you had figured you got to study it all, and so you end up there was a lot of stuff then you memorized. Maybe you pull an all-nighter to cram, and then a lot of that stuff wasn't on the exam. Of course, maybe you can understand that you were made to study it all, so you learn more than what was on the test. After all, the purpose of a test is to learn, isn't it? Or maybe the teacher or assistant did prepare you, supposedly, but it was so misleading, the preparation. This is on the test. This is a study for that. It was so different from what was on the test that you wonder if the teacher wanted you to fail. Ever had a teacher who you think wanted to fail you? Actually, people who fail their test often blame their teacher. Or maybe it's athletics or music. You want to make the team or the orchestra, but there are only so many spots. You have to go through tryouts, see if you're one of the best. You should be in one of those spots. The coach or conductor is going to watch or listen to you play. Some people would be so intimidated by that, so afraid to lose, afraid of being told that they're not good enough, not making it. Or maybe they're just so proud, and they're not afraid. Maybe they're just so proud that they can't believe they're being asked to prove they're good. They have to have their skills appraised. Their attitude is, don't you know who I am? I'm the next LeBron James or Yo-Yo Ma. They've been told all their life that they're so good, they're so incredibly talented. You're amazing, sweetheart. Don't let anyone tell you any different. The idea of not being believed, of how great they are, of actually having to prove themselves, that offends them, and they will not submit to it. They won't put up with such humiliation. The band, the team, the drama club, Broadway, the Supreme Court will just have to suffer without their brilliance. That'll show them, they think. How do you react to being tested? Some people think that the very idea of being tested, of going through tryouts, having your skills or knowledge or character put on trial, That's just wrong. You should be accepted as you are. Unconditional love, after all, right? And then in that atmosphere where you're accepted and you're told how great you are, so the philosophy goes, they will flourish. If they're told they're geniuses, they'll naturally absorb knowledge like a sponge, and soon they'll win a Nobel Prize. If they're told they're the next LeBron James, well, just go ahead, sign them up for the NBA and shoe contracts now. The opposite is actually usually the case. Kids who are told that they're just great, they deserve the A, they deserve the spotting start on the team or the leading chair in the orchestra, and if anyone doesn't give it to them, there's something wrong with them. Kids raised with that, their heads stuffed with that kind of ideas, they often resent the obstacles that are put in their way. The long hours of practice that they have to do, the implied criticism, you still need to practice, you still need to work, that they're not perfect yet. Then they get paranoid. And maybe everyone's out to get them. And they give up. While on the other hand, Michael Jordan was cut from his high school basketball team after tryouts and used that as motivation to become the best basketball player he could be, which turned out to be arguably the best basketball player ever. How do you react to being tested? Well, that's what James, the servant of God and the Lord Jesus Christ, that's what he calls himself, that's what he wants to tell you, how to react to it. He tells you of God's people dispersed throughout the world, here in this passage, here's how you're to take testing. Here's how to regard it. Here's what to count it as, how to think of it, how to categorize it. Where do you put it in your mind? This is just a horrible thing I'm going through. Why do horrible things happen to me? Or there's something better. Here's how to take testing. And what not to count it as. What to do when you're being tested. And what it can do for you. And we see that here in two broad parts. First, there's testing for maturity. And then there's testing for blessing. How do you react to testing? Want me to test you and we'll see how you react? Well, you count it all joy. Well, that sounds great. There's joy in every circumstance, every test. Really? How about your mother's funeral? How about if you catch your spouse in an affair? How about if you're served divorce papers? How about if the diagnosis is you have a month to live? How about if your son is sentenced to 20 years in prison? How about a miscarriage? How about if you're fired? How about if you fail? You won't get the degree you were working for. You won't get the career you've dreamed of. How about if you're alone in a quiet house because you just returned from burying your spouse? Count it all joy? That sounds almost insulting, doesn't it? Are you just supposed to put on a plastic smile, say, praise the Lord, and pretend it is well with my soul? Well, not quite. First, this is not what you tell other people when they're going through trials of various kinds. That phrase, various kinds, it literally means multicolored trials. It's a funny phrase, isn't it? Multicolored trials. Maybe blue ones, blue trials of grief, of depression. Red ones, temptations to passion, of lust or anger, violent hatred. Yellow ones of cowardice, afraid to stand up for what you believe. Pressure's being put on. Maybe green ones of greed and of envy, always wanting more things, more cash. All kinds of trials, not just temptations to sin, not just persecutions from opponents of the faith, but every variety of trying experience. Maybe from the boredom and the sleepiness as you wake up in the morning and it keeps you from praying and reading the Bible. Or the worst, the funeral of a loved one. Maybe the doctor giving you the bad news. It is all maturing experience that God works good out of for us, those who love him. It says in Romans 8:28. So yes, count it all joy that you're being matured by God. God is working good out of it. But don't, some advice, don't tell that to other people, at least not at first. when they're going through a horrible trial. Don't show up at a funeral with their mother in a casket and say, "Count it all joy." Don't do that. If you do, you might be in a trial yourself. But you need to take your own advice. Now, sure, they should look eventually for the maturing that they can get out of this experience, the work that God is doing through it for their good. They should. But your test at that moment is whether you will now grieve with those who grieve and weep with those who weep. James can tell them, and you, later, to count it all joy. And notice he addresses his readers, us, as brothers, later as beloved brothers. He's affectionate. He's compassionate to those going through all kinds of trials. And so should we be. Count it all joy because in verse 3, you know, notice that, you know. I hope you know. Do you know? You know the sovereignty of God, that God, controls the trials. The original readers knew why to count it all joy. They knew that God was testing their faith. Whether their faith was in the Lord and not in people, not in family, not in money, not in whatever it is you're being tested about. They knew God was in control of this test that they're going through. They knew that. Do you know that? Notice how that is implied here, that God is in control of it. Why should you count all kinds of trials? Health trials, career trials, family trials, money trials, you're running low. Your temper tried by a nagging child. The trial of not having enough cash. The trial of being in another country where hardly anyone speaks your language, and so you have to read notes to help you understand what's going on in the sermon. That's a trial. The trial of a cold, distant husband. The trial of a disrespectful, argumentative wife. The trial of some unfulfilled desire. The trial of not having any ice cream in the freezer. Oh, that's a trial. The trial of gaining too much weight when you eat too much ice cream. The trial of a boring preacher who talks too long. Why should you count all of it, without exception, is joy? That's where you put it, categorize it. This is joy. Because your faith is being tested to produce steadfastness, endurance. Well, tested by who? By God. Of course, that's assumed here. That's what they know. Do you know that? It's implied here that God is in perfect control of these trials, that they are for His purpose. You can count His purpose joy because He works good out of everything for us, for the 12 tribes in the dispersion, for those who love Him, for the church. The original audience knew that God was in control, and so they could look to God for His maturing work in every trial. Do you know that? You know, when we say God is sovereign, He is in control, we talked about this in Sunday school, but that not one molecule in the universe moves without His permission. Some say, even some well-meaning Christians say, and they think they're defending God's honor. They say, well, if you say that, you see the sovereignty of God, then that makes God responsible for evil. Particularly here, it's trials. Something's trying means it's something you don't like, and you're being put through. Some of those things are evil. So you're saying God is responsible for that evil? For disasters? For Hurricane Florence? For all the destruction? For the 1-year-old baby that was swept out of a car and drowned somewhere near Wilmington last week? He makes God responsible for the brain tumors and the car wrecks and the terrorist attacks, everything. And so they say, well, that can't be. God has just let the world go to honor our free will. There's two problems with that. First, they say, if they're Christians, that God is all-powerful. Therefore, then He could stop these things. He could have stopped Hurricane Florence. He could stop terrorism. But He doesn't, and He does that to protect our free will. Well, how does that protect God's honor? How is that any better than what we believe? If God sees Al-Qaeda plotting a terrorist attack, if He's God and He knows all things, and He sees that they're plotting a terrorist attack, and God doesn't expose that to the FBI so that they can stop it, how is that preserving our free will? I don't get that. Particularly if you're one of the people on the plane that they hijacked. I chose to take a flight in a plane. I didn't choose to get hijacked. So how's my free will protected? They say God can't be in control because that makes him responsible for evil, but still they say, well, he knows about the evil, he sees it coming, he has the power to stop it, but he doesn't do it to protect our free will. How's that work? And how's that any better for his honor? How does that make God look better than what I'm saying and what the Bible's saying? How have they really protected God's reputation? Put it this way, if one of you, and I'm not picking on those of you who have children, but just an example, if one of you parents allowed your child just to run amok in here, I mean, making a total mess, tearing everything that could be torn, this tablecloth and ripping it up and spilling drinks everywhere and throwing food and deflating our basketballs and whatever, all that, ripping stuff down from the wall. And you just sit back and say, well, I've got to let my little darling have his or her free will. How is that any better than if you had caused the mess yourself? I don't get it. You had the power to stop it, but you didn't. It's still your mess. And no, I'm not telling Justin to go back there and look after his kids. I'm not giving a hint to him to make sure he's not causing a mess back there. I'm not doing that. But even more importantly, really, so that's sort of philosophically, more relevant to this passage here is if God is not in control of Hurricane Florence or the tumors or the wrecks and all of it, then how do we count them as all joy? I mean, how are they joy? How are they trying our faith? How are they producing, endurance, something good for us? Because God's not in control of them. They're just things that happen, and God wishes that they didn't happen. God is just as horrified and just as victimized as we are when they happen. So they are then purposeless suffering. Like there's that joke Joe told it in Sunday school that some people say, well, we believe God is sovereign. When fall down a flight of stairs, you say, well, thank God that's over. But, they tell that to say how ridiculous your position is. Everything is foreordained by God. What's the alternative? Alternative is just random events out of God's control, and then you fall down a flight of stairs, and why couldn't God stop me? He doesn't care about me. He's not able. It's just random suffering. There's nothing good out of it. How's that better? How will you improve things by this idea that God has let creation go amok? But maybe you think if a disaster happened, maybe he'll rescue us out of some disaster if we let him rescue us. But there's nothing good in the trials themselves. He's not tying our faith because he's not in control of the trials. There's nothing good he's working out of them for us, for those who love him. And so you can then, if that's the way things are, you can tell your friend at the funeral of their mother, this is just horrible. And you can weep like the heathen who have no hope. Because there isn't any. You have a God who either can't stop the tragedies. He's just wringing his hands and biting his nails, hoping that bad things won't happen to us, hoping that little storm in the Atlantic Ocean doesn't turn into a big hurricane and start a lot of floods. But he can't do anything about it because he's got to preserve our free will. Or, so you have a God either who can't stop anything, or he can stop it and just doesn't care. He just doesn't care about the disasters. So then count all the trials, if that's the case, just count them as hopeless tragedies. That's worse, isn't it? But the point here is that we are to count all kinds of trials, all the multicolored trials, as joy, because we are to know that our faith is being tested by God, who is in control of them. And he's doing it to produce steadfastness, endurance, staying power, because he loves us. We can count all trials joy because God is working good out of them for us, because he is in control of them. You need trials to strengthen your endurance. In athletics, the only way to produce endurance, physical endurance, is by trying, stretching, exhausting, pushing your endurance about as far as it will go, and then trying to push it harder. There comes a point in a workout, whether you're running or swimming or biking or lifting or whatever you're doing, when you cross the line into pushing your endurance. And a lot of the workout really is building up to that point, and it's that crucial moment when you're really exhausted and are you going to keep going? And that's when your endurance is stretched. Just last Tuesday night, I swam with a group, a workout, and we did 20 100-yard repeats, one 100-yard sprint every 2 minutes. There's a clock going. Every 2 minutes, we start another 100 yards. The good swimmers, of which I'm not one, good swimmers swim 100 yards in about a minute 15, a minute 20. They're really good. It takes me about a minute 40, and I slow to about a 145 when I get really tired. And that means that I only have about 20 to 15 seconds until got to start the next repeat, the next 100 yards. Now, the first few, it's not hard. 100 yards, not bad. You can sprint it. The first 5 or so, not difficult. But it's when we get to 10, 11, I'm exhausted. There's still 10 and 9 more to go. You know, the end is not in sight to give you hope. And it's then I want to quit. But it's then that crucial moment. Your muscles are burning, exhausted. You don't feel like you can go. You get to the end. You're breathing. You know, it's then when your endurance is stretched. If you'll keep doing it, if you want to get better, then when the feeling of burning sets in, when you're breathing hard, when you really want to stop, then when that feeling comes, if you really want endurance, well, you count that feeling as joy. This is what I'm after. This time right now, this is what I've been building for, because I want more endurance. You need trials to strengthen your endurance. You know, you don't feel like reading the Bible anymore, especially if you're in Leviticus. You know, okay, I understand that. Or you're praying, you don't feel like praying anymore, especially if it's in the morning, I got to get to work, can I sleep a little longer? Or going to church or giving. You don't feel like turning away from pornography, you don't feel like denying yourself, but you've got to keep doing it. And I think Christians these days, well-meaning, but they often try to, prevent this in the wrong way. You know, instead of saying, you need to be faithful to your marriage, and instead of saying, what you need to learn is endurance. You need to learn faithfulness. Keep going. Instead of saying that, they'll often teach what you need to do is you need to revive that first feeling of love and passion. And they're always trying to revive that. Or with the Lord. And, instead of teaching you got to have endurance, you just need to always go back to that first, new experience when it was all new. Okay, I can kind of understand that. But you need to learn endurance. And sometimes you need to tell people that. You may not have the feelings anymore. You need to persevere. And that's what Christians often need to be told. In 1 Samuel chapter 30, David hit bottom. And you think about it, he's been promised for years that he will be the king. That's that promise he has. But he spent years instead running away from Saul, being chased over the countryside like an outlaw. He's had to sleep in caves and on the ground. He's probably thinking, God told me I was going to be a king. I'm going to have a palace and I have a big bed. Instead, I'm lying on the ground in this cave trying to hide out. And he eventually had to retreat to Philistine territory because there Saul couldn't get to him with his band of mostly riffraff, men who are just discontent with Saul. There are always people like that who are always discontent with whoever's in charge at the time. And these men attracted to David were like that. They were discontent. And they thought it would be fun to join David's outlaw gang. And one day they came back to find to their camp that the Amalekites had raided their home base in Philistine territory while they were away, taking away all their family and their wives and their children and all their stuff, everything they had. It says in 2 Samuel chapter 30, verse 6, that David was greatly distressed. His gang of malcontents was now discontent with him. And they were thinking of stoning him. It says all the people were bitter in soul. All these I'm supposed to be a king. I'm supposed to be on top. But now I'm treated like a fugitive. And now after all that I've been through, now I'm robbed and my family's been kidnapped. Now even the few followers that I have, I'm supposed to be leading a whole nation, but these few followers I have are wanting to turn against me. Oh, I want to give up. But at the end of 2 Samuel chapter 30, verse 6, it says, David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. He counted it all joy. He he reminded himself of the promises of God. He believed those promises. And then he got up and went out and rescued his family and the families of his men. Got his stuff back too. If you hit bottom, strengthen yourself in the Lord your God. Then get up and be more than a conqueror. Let your steadfastness, your perseverance mature. And when it does, you'll finally be mature, perfectly mature. Not perfect as in sinless, but having, at least to some degree, every strength, every quality that you need. The love, the joy, the peace, the patience, the kindness, the goodness, the faithfulness, the gentleness, the self-control. Every one you need. Maybe not each one perfectly, fully, but you won't be completely lacking in any of them if you let your endurance grow. So if you want that, like an athlete pushing himself during a workout, you want that endurance to grow, to strengthen. First count testing, categorize it as joy. You think, this is what I'm after. I'm after being a faithful, persevering Christian. Then in verses 5 to 8, ask for wisdom. If you're being tested, and you are, then you need wisdom. If you lack wisdom, then ask God for it. Wisdom is practical righteousness in everyday living. Okay? You may think, I've accepted that God's in control, that he's working good out of this trial. I'm praising him in the storm, as the song goes. Now what do I do? There's a disaster. There's a failure in the family. There's a bad report from the blood test, from the MRI. There's the demand that I have to support what the Bible calls a perversion. If I'm not, I lose my job or whatever. Now, how do I handle it? Practically. Pray for wisdom. God gives wisdom generously. He might reveal it directly in his word. The Bible might address it. He might give wisdom through the advice of a doctor or a friend or some book that you read. He has thrown out a lot of wisdom out there for you to pick up. He's filled the universe with wisdom, if you can see it, available to you, if you're open to it. So believe that God gives wisdom generously. He's not stingy about dispensing wisdom. He's not going to be scolding you. Oh, you're so stupid. You didn't know what to do in this test. Don't be double-minded about it. Believing the Lord in one mind, but not in the other. You know, the double-minded person, he says, is unstable because he has two minds, and he's shifting back and forth between the two. There's one a believing mind that looks to God's word, the other a doubting mind that thinks just like the world. So we have people who in one mind they might believe all the promises of God's word about salvation, about Christ, and then are completely worldly about practical things. Maybe like giving. Okay, I understand. You got to give a minimum. You got to pay your dues, after all, like any club. But you don't have to be generous. Our relationship with the church, it's just for my consuming, like a restaurant. It's what the world's taught them. So he's unstable. He's going back and forth between thinking and living like a Christian on the one hand and like a worldly pagan on the other. In time of testing, he doesn't know what to do. So he's paralyzed. He's kind of stunned, like a deer in the headlights. What do I do? I see there's this thing with lights coming right at me, and I'll stand here in the road, figure out what's happening. God's word says maybe something like purge the evil person from among you, but the culture says no way. You're an individualist. To each his own. He can't decide because he's still partly, in one mind, worldly. So he won't receive anything from the Lord. Not until he becomes single-minded, wholeheartedly devoted to the Lord, willing to live practically by the Lord's wisdom. Money is a test. It shows what you desire, where your hope is. Whether you're poor or rich or somewhere in between, you're being tested by what you do with your money. Every cent you have or want to have is putting you on trial, showing you what you're made of. If you want to see how you're doing in this test so far, well, look at your checkbook or your credit card statement or your daydreams about what you wish you could have Oh, if I could only have that mansion. If you're poor and lowly, you're being tested by whether your hope is in the Lord. Whether you believe that's where your exaltation will come from. You're tired of being one of these lowly people who has to drive some, car that's barely getting by. You want to have the BMW. That's where your exaltation will come from, the money that you can buy it with. That dream of being rich. So gambling, the lottery appeals to you. If you only hit it big, that's what is always appealing to people. Then you'll be rich, and then you'll be exalted, and then you can boast. That's what you need. You need enough money to have your own BMW and plane and all that. So spend that dollar for a ticket. That's your ticket out of your lowliness. Or maybe if you're too smart to fall for that, because you know the statistics that you're almost bound to lose, but you'll spend your whole life chasing dollars. You still think it's the money that's your way to be exalted, the way to the life that you want. But you realize it's going to take work day in and day out. And you're willing to do it because that's where your exaltation comes from. You're going after that pot of gold at the end of a rainbow because you're sure that your money, your exaltation comes from money. James says, boast in the exaltation from the Lord, that he has already promised you a crown and will lift you up out of death and gather you around the throne. Come, we that love the Lord, and let our joys be known. So you can endure trial because you believe your exaltation comes from him, the one who's in charge of the trial. The rich should endure through trials because it reminds them of what all their money and their luxuries and their vacations and their insurance policies and their expensive doctors they can go to all tempt them to forget. That they were humiliated in their sin and captivity to the world and the flesh and the devil. They especially need to boast in their humiliation, their mortality, that they're like grass. That even though they can afford the best medical care that science can give, that they are flesh, and all flesh is grass. From Isaiah chapter 40, verse 6, James is quoting here. All flesh is grass, and its beauty from the best salons, even with the best suits and dresses, adorned with the costliest jewelry, and sitting in the back of the nicest cars and relaxing in the nicest houses, is like the flower of the fields. The grass withers, the flower fades when the breath of the Lord blows on it. All the money in the world won't keep the rich from fading away. The billionaire can spend his whole life chasing more billions, but he still can't outrun the Lord and his own death. The Christian rich need to remember that, and so boast in their humiliation and their weakness, the fact that they too will die, and all that they work for will be handed down to who knows, to their children, and who knows what they will do with it. We all need to remind ourselves to see through the facade of wealth. Because it's a facade. It's fake. As soon as it's going to disappear. People go to the Biltmore, see that grand castle and the exorbitant wealth that's displayed there, and what they can get if only they get that much money. And I think a lot of people go there to see what they dream of, what they'd love to get enough money to afford. Maybe to remind themselves that wealth really is the ticket to the best life. That it's not a facade, that it's not fake. They could have this if they only get enough. Well, what they should do is visit the grave of George Washington Vanderbilt, the man who had that estate built, and remind themselves that all his money, so much of it squandered on his own self-indulgence, didn't keep him out of the ground. Boast in your humiliation. I'm like grass, like a flower of the field. Soon the wind of the Lord blows and I wither. So you put your hope in the Lord and not in uncertain riches. Money is a test. How are you doing so far? There is testing for maturity, and there's also testing for blessing, starting in verse 12. If you're tested and you remain steadfast, you endure. Maybe you don't feel the thrill of being, quote, in love anymore, but you stay faithful to your spouse. You keep reading your Bible and praying and staying faithful to a member of a church. You persevere. If that's the kind of person you are, then blessed are you. Blessed means happy, joyful. And you'll be blessed and happy and joyful. First, in verse 2, you count it all joy when you go through various kinds of trials because it expands your endurance. And then in verse 12, you'll be joyful when you endure because when you have stood the test, you will receive what he calls the crown of life. Like that crown we heard about last week, remember? Paul's crown of righteousness. He talked about, he said it was, henceforth there is laid up for me from this point onward. He could see the crown just up ahead to be put on his head after he endured having his head chopped off. You'll be crowned with life if you're faithful to death. Your life comes from being right with the Lord, and so the crown of rightness with him is the crown of life. Same crowns, I think, and that's something to be happy about. You're blessed. God promises that crown. He says at the second half of verse 12, to those who love him. It doesn't say to those who keep his rules, although if you love him, you'll want to keep his rules. But it is the love that comes first. Religious people can keep his rules without loving him, but there's no crown for that, of righteousness or of life. The crown is promised for that same group of people that God determined to work good out of from every trial. You remember who they were? Who gets the crown? Who gets good out of every trial? Remember Romans 8:28? Same thing James says here. He works all things together for good, not for everyone. A crown isn't promised for everyone, but for those who love him and are called according to his purpose. Then do we earn the crown, blessedness, eternal joy, simply by loving God? How do we love God? Well, because he first loved us. He loves us first, and then we love him and get a crown after enduring under trial. Some might think, well, if he loves us, why does he try us? Why doesn't he just accept us? Why does he test us for? I thought tests were unloving, aren't they cruel? No, they produce steadfastness. They produce staying power. He tries every one of his children to give them that staying power, so they'll have the power to stay with him. So is he tempting us? No, he's trying, but he's not tempting. Even if in most trials there is a temptation, there's a temptation to quit, to give up hope, to be adulterous, to be unfaithful, to be a money lover, because you really want a mansion like that, George Washington. I mean, you've seen that Biltmore Estates, George Washington Vanderbilt's house? Man, that's what I want. The trials may come from him, but the temptation comes from the world telling us to conform to its greedy, selfish, consumerist ways, or from our flesh, from our own sinful nature. That's what we desire. We crave that luxury. Or from the devil himself. God tries, but doesn't tempt. If you don't know that the problem comes from you, then you'll be wondering about him. Maybe God's the problem. So when you are tried, rather than being faithful and enduring, you blame your desire to give up. Maybe it's on God. He put me through this trial, so he's tempting me to give up, to give in. You think, no. You may think he's like a teacher that wants you to fail. No, he's not. He's trying you to produce endurance so you can have the blessing of joy, of a crown of life. The temptation is coming from you. God can't be tempted with evil. There's nothing in him that is drawn to evil, that evil appeals to, like there is in us. He tempts no one with evil, but he does try them. And if someone fails their trial, if Pontius Pilate and Herod, they're called to do justice. They're called to not murder an innocent man that's put before them. And if they're tried, if they are put on trial, as they put Jesus on trial, they didn't know it. They were putting Jesus on trial, but they were being tried too. And if they fail, they are tempted by a vicious mob to do injustice, to murder. If they give in to that temptation, That's because they were enticed by their own desires to cave in, to succumb to the crowds instead of standing up for what is right. And God knew that they would do that, and he put them in place to accomplish his plan. But the trial, both the human one of Jesus and the spiritual one of Herod and Pontius Pilate, the trial was from God. The temptation to do evil came from Herod and Pilate. If you fail, if you give into the world, the flesh and the devil, that's because you were lured away from enduring, steadfastly continuing God's way, from resisting temptation. And that's because you believed the promises that temptations whispered in your ear. You know, that God's trying to keep something good from you. He's keeping this delicious fruit from you just to deprive you. It looks so good. He just doesn't want you to have it just because it's good. He doesn't want you to have your exaltation. He wants to keep you down. And no, contrary to what he says, there won't be any punishment for the sin. It'll be great. It'll give you the life that you want. That's what the desires tell us. We desire what temptation offers. Maybe a sexual experience, the mansion that money can buy, the vengeance we want to vent, the friends we can win over, the popularity we can gain. We desire that instead of loving God, and that desire gives birth to sin, which brings us to death. God doesn't try us to kill us, but some he tries are lured away by the desires that are in them, and they're killed by those desires. They prefer the cash and the self-indulgence, the pride to what God offers. They don't want to boast in their humiliation. They don't want to be dependent on grace, and so they fall away. They desired something other than God, and so are drawn away to their death. The trial shows their lack of love for God, and so that their heart is dead. But if you have life, if you have really been born again, how did that come, by the way? I mean, if you're dead, you're drawn away. But if you have life, it's not by our will, he says here in verse 18. Notice that. John says the same thing in John chapter 1, verse 13, that Jesus came to give life and to make people sons of God, born again, not by the will of the flesh, not by the will of man, not by our will, but by God's will. James says the same thing here in verse 18, of his own will, of God's own will. We were born again, not of the will of man, but of God. Paul says in Romans chapter 9, verse 16, it does not depend on man's desire or effort, but on God's mercy. Here, verse 18, of his own will, of God's own will, he brought us forth. Forth from what? From death. From being dead in our sins, our trespasses. From that death that temptation was drawing us into, but he brought us out of that death, of his own will. So if you have that divine life, you're not trapped in death, then you will endure, you will persevere under trial, you will be steadfast, you will have that staying power. That life in you gives you that power to stay. Perseverance, as a statement of faith says, is the grand mark of a truly saved person that separates him or her from the, what we call superficial professors, those who profess outwardly, but they're just a surface faith. They say, but they don't have it. They don't persevere. Those who say they believe, but when trials come, they fall away, showing their superficiality. So, he says in verse 16, beloved brothers or sisters, again, affectionate, don't be deceived by sin, by temptation, to be lured away by it. Every good and perfect gift is from above, from the Father, the creator of lights and of light itself. And he's not double-minded. He's not loving you in one mind while, tempting to destroy you in another. And you can't be sure if he's just unsteady like you are. You might be unsteady, he's not. There's no shadow due to change because he's consistent. And so if he has laid up for you a crown, then you can be sure he will get you to have it. He won't change his mind. He doesn't change his mind. He's not unsteady. He'll get you through the trials that he's brought to grow your endurance. Just as he said, let there be light, he also said, let there be life. And so bringing us new life through what he calls here the word of truth, through the gospel. He spoke life to us through the gospel. He did that so that, in verse 18, this is the purpose that he willed to bring us to life through the instrument of the gospel. You know, faith came by hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ, by the gospel, so that, for the purpose, that we would be, he says here, a kind of first fruit. First fruit, that's an offering, a sacrifice. We will be, our whole person, our body and soul and spirit, an offering to the Father, given from this old creation, salvaged out of this world that's passing away. We will be given as an offering from this old creation to God in the new creation. We will be a living sacrifice. We will be a spiritual act of worship. He's testing us. So we'll be renewed, that we can be good and acceptable and perfect. That's why we count it all joy, even below the surface at funerals, even when it seems that our world is falling apart. God is working through it all to get us to that new creation, alive, first fruits there, living sacrifices, blessed and joyous forever, and thus surround the throne. And don't you want to be there? Don't you see that it is better than anything the world has to offer? Even better than Biltmore Estates or whatever ramshackle shack the world tries to lure us away with. So endure, believe, don't be double-minded and unstable. Have a single-hearted love for the Lord. Desire him above all, so much so you'll bear whatever you have to bear to be crowned by him. And so you'll pass the test.